Let us be united, soldiers, gendarmes and police. Do not let money bribe us into shooting our friends, brothers and sisters. We are the people. Return to the population.
Despite the president's decree, Antananarivo burned on. Elite Capsat soldiers abandoned barracks and marched with protesters into May 13th Square, escorting crowds past barricades. General Rufin Fortunate Zafasambo, now Prime Minister, condemned excessive force and called for dialogue, while President Andry Rajoelina grew increasingly isolated behind palace walls. Curfews and roadblocks multiplied as demonstrations spread to regional towns, power cuts and water shortages fed the fury. In several districts, citizens targeted Jarama offices. Now fishermen and farmers joined marches. State control frayed not in a single blast but through quiet defections, commanders refusing orders, ministers disappearing, media channels muted. The question hardened into an accusation: is Madagascar facing a silent transfer of power, or a rebirth under military guardianship? It was never about ballots or campaigns, not really. In Madagascar, the language of democracy had long been reduced to ritual, slogans, flags, and a chorus of promises drowned out by hunger and dust. While the people queued for rice, others queued for contracts. And somewhere between the two, power was quietly auctioned. When Andry Rajoelina returned to office in 2023, the story was framed as a democratic comeback. Western observers applauded, European envoys smiled, and a few lines in the media celebrated stability. But beneath the surface, a different current was forming, one that would soon clash with the foreign scripted order. The Malagasy army, once content to remain in the shadows, began whispering about the AES model, the way Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso had defied military stigma and rewritten sovereignty with discipline and unity. Young officers, especially those trained abroad and disillusioned by empty reforms, saw in Traoré's example not dictatorship, but direction. For them, sovereignty was not an abstract slogan. It was the right to control their gold, their cobalt, their ports. They looked at the statistics, how Madagascar exported billions in raw resources while importing hunger, and asked the same forbidden question that echoed from Ouagadougou to Niamey: if democracy means dependency, what does independence mean? The silence from Antananarivo's palace was deafening. The president spoke of development, while signing new exploration deals with European firms. He praised partnerships, even as Chinese and Emirati investors expanded their footprint across mining sites once guarded by locals. Every handshake was televised. Every concession hidden in fine print. Meanwhile, the military watched. Not as rebels, but as patriots out of patience. They saw villages displaced for nickel projects, rivers poisoned by tailings, and youths migrating to cities with nothing but plastic sandals and anger. The promise of democracy had turned into a mirage shimmering over the island's red soil. And in that mirage, they saw their own reflection, the same betrayal that had once lit the spark in Bamako and Ouagadougou. The whispers turned into networks. Retired colonels began teaching political economy in informal circles. Young officers debated the meaning of sovereignty not in parliament, but in barracks. Civil groups, women, teachers, engineers, began meeting with them in secret, not to plot war, but to imagine order. The West, of course, noticed. Intelligence cables began describing military unrest and possible destabilization. Analysts in Paris and Washington dusted off their old playbooks, the same manuals they had used to describe Traoré and Goïta before their revolutions. Yet this time, the situation was slipperier. Madagascar was not in the Sahel. It was an island, geographically distant, but spiritually aligning with the same continental wave of resistance. The term, African Spring, was quietly murmured in diplomatic briefings, though no one dared say it aloud. Because if Madagascar, long considered a docile democracy, began to drift toward the AES model, then France's entire Indian Ocean architecture would tremble. Diego Suarez, the northern port hosting a French naval presence, was already being reconsidered by local activists as a foreign enclave. Protests began forming online, linking sovereignty to dignity. And dignity to defense. By mid-2025, something had shifted. The language of reform was no longer about aid or governance, but about control. Who controls the mines? Who controls the ports? Who controls the soldiers who defend them? The answer, for the first time in decades, was no longer clear. Within this uncertainty lay both danger and awakening. For the people, fatigue had turned into quiet defiance. For the soldiers, obedience had turned into reflection. And for the region, the question of whether Madagascar would follow the AES path was no longer theoretical, it was a countdown. Perhaps the most telling moment came in June 2025. When a leaked document revealed discussions between Malagasy officers and counterparts from Burkina Faso and Mali during a regional security coordination meeting in Addis Ababa. The West called it coincidence. But on Malagasy social media, it became prophecy. In the markets of Antananarivo, a vendor whispered, "They said our generals met Traoré's men. Maybe it's time we wake up too." For the first time in years, that whisper spread faster than inflation. It was never about coups, not really. It was about reclaiming a voice long sold. About turning the island from a client into a compass. The mirage was fading. What remained was a reflection, raw, unfinished, but finally real. Night descends upon Antananarivo like a velvet shroud. At 2100 hours sharp, the national television signal cuts without warning. The screen flickers, then fades to black. For 15 long minutes. The island holds its breath. Then, as abruptly as it vanished, the broadcast returns, not with a news anchor, not with the president, but with the cold, unmoving frame of a soldier in uniform. General Zafasambo appears behind a wooden desk, the national flag half-lit behind him. His tone is steady, almost paternal. "Brothers and sisters," he says, "Madagascar must remain united. Order must be restored. Our loyalty is to the people. No declaration of a coup. No condemnation of the president. Just an address, eerily calm, and broadcast to a nation that had already felt the ground shifting under its feet." But the world outside the island is less patient. Within hours, foreign correspondents begin to ask, who is really in control of Madagascar? That question alone, repeated across screens from Paris to Washington, changes the rhythm of the crisis. Because sometimes, power doesn't announce itself, it simply begins to act as if it already exists. At dawn, two ministers, Interior and Defense, announce temporary medical leave. By mid-morning, armored vehicles from the Capsat regiment are parked silently around the presidential palace and the Avado airport. No barricades. No gunfire. No chance of revolution. Just stillness. A thick, deliberate silence, the kind that speaks louder than any manifesto. In the markets of Ainalakely, vendors keep selling fruit and charcoal as if nothing happened. But every few minutes, someone glances toward the sky. Rumors move faster than radio. They say the army has taken the capital. No, another whispers, they're protecting it. In Madagascar, words are like wind, you can't catch them, but you can feel their direction. As evening falls again, a group of students march down Independence Avenue, holding candles and singing, Azamiala, don't leave the country. Their voices rise, trembling yet defiant, carried by the humid air. To many, it's not a protest. It's a prayer. A prayer for leadership that doesn't vanish with the next crisis. Among the youth, especially those who had watched Burkina Faso and Mali rewrite their fates, something new stirs. They speak not of rebellion, but of reclaiming destiny. Online. A new phrase trends through Malagasy and French hashtags alike, AES spirit in the Indian Ocean. No one knows exactly what it means, but everyone senses what it suggests. A quiet alignment. A continental current reaching beyond the Sahel, touching the sea. Then come the subtle signs, fragments of a bigger pattern. A French news outlet reports that West African military advisors were seen arriving at the port of Diego Suarez. Local dockworkers swear they unloaded crates of humanitarian equipment, though no aid agency has claimed responsibility. 2 nights later, radar trackers show a transport plane from Ouagadougou landing on Nosy Island under diplomatic clearance. Officially, it carries logistical support for coastal security. Unofficially, nobody knows. But whispers multiply. In Paris, the foreign ministry summons its ambassador to Madagascar for urgent consultations. The communiqué avoids naming names, yet the tension is unmistakable. For decades, Diego Suarez was a jewel of French naval strategy, a gateway to the Mozambique Channel. The artery linking East Africa to the Indo-Pacific. Now, the tricolor flag still flutters there, but the control, like the wind, feels different. Inside Madagascar, the air grows heavier. As if the island itself knows it's being watched. On state radio, patriotic songs replace talk shows. University professors cancel classes for security reasons. And through it all, General Zafasambo remains silent, no further addresses, no interviews, no decrees. His silence becomes its own kind of authority. People begin calling him the man who spoke once. In the slums of Anasaib, graffiti spreads overnight. New York Fahanjanana Diaharan New York Olona, silence is the power of the people. Every word feels deliberate, every act symbolic. It's not a coup d'état in the classic sense. It's something more elusive, a controlled reset, carried not by slogans, but by restraint. Across the ocean, intelligence briefings circulate quietly through African embassies. Analysts note the timing, the Sahel's consolidation under AES, the growing talk of African self-defense structures, and now a disciplined military in Madagascar, moving without firing a shot. Coincidence, perhaps. Or a strategy unfolding one coastline at a time. A senior diplomat from a neighboring country puts it bluntly. Madagascar is not falling. It's realigning. Realigning, the word carries weight. Not just politically, but spiritually. Because for many Africans, the idea of AES has ceased to mean just an alliance, it's a philosophy, a conviction that Africa must guard its own sovereignty. No matter how far its shores stretch. Late at night, on the northern coast, a soldier stands on a watchtower overlooking the city. The lights below flicker like embers in a sleeping volcano. His rifle rests against the wall, he isn't expecting enemies, only questions. He looks toward the horizon where the dark sea meets the stars, and whispers to himself. We are not rebels. We are guardians. Far below, the streets of Antananarivo hum softly with the life of a nation caught between fear and faith. No coups have been declared, no governments have fallen, yet something irreversible has already begun. You can sense it in the way people walk, the way they pause before speaking, the way silence itself has become an anthem. Some revolutions don't begin with gunfire. They begin with silence. At sunrise, the Indian Ocean looks calm, too calm. But beneath that mirror of water, the tectonic plates of geopolitics are grinding. In every embassy from Nairobi to Paris, phones buzz, lights blink, and cables whisper the same question. Is this a coup, or the birth of something larger? Madagascar has gone quiet, but the world has begun to speak. In Brussels, the European Union releases a statement couched in diplomatic caution. We express deep concern over the military's involvement in Madagascar's political process and urge a return to civilian governance. It is the same template used for Mali, for Burkina Faso, for Niger. Only the names change, the tone remains sterile, rehearsed, almost fatigued. In Washington, a State Department official tells reporters that the United States is closely monitoring the situation. He avoids the word coup. Because to label it would mean choosing a side, and choosing a side means acknowledging that something in Africa has shifted beyond control. Moscow says nothing. Beijing says less. But their silence, like Zafasambo's, speaks of patience and calculation. Meanwhile, the press splits into two worlds. Western channels headline it as a creeping coup. They replay footage of military trucks, speculate about Russian influence, and flash satellite images of Diego Suarez as if decoding a secret. But across the African press, the tone is strikingly different. Madagascar stands where Sahel once stood, reads one editorial in Bamako. Another headline in Ouagadougou simply says, the island has awakened. Across the continent, #surge, #Indian Ocean Rising. #Africa owns tomorrow. To those who had once been called unstable, this moment feels like vindication, not rebellion, but recognition. Inside Madagascar, the structure of power begins to reassemble. General Zafasambo appears once more on national television, this time flanked by men in uniform and civilian suits. He announces the formation of a transitional government for national security. The camera pans across the faces, engineers, doctors, even a few former opposition figures. The message is subtle but clear, this is not a junta, it is a correction. President Rajoelina remains the constitutional head of state. But his presence is ceremonial now. His decrees require joint military endorsement. He smiles at the cameras, but his hands tremble slightly as he adjusts the microphone. The power balance has shifted, silently. Irreversibly. In the new cabinet, generals oversee energy, defense, and transportation. Every portfolio tied to national sovereignty is now guarded by the uniform. And yet, the streets are calm. Markets are open. Children go to school under the red-green-white flag fluttering as if nothing changed, even as everything has. The world strategists begin to draw new maps. Madagascar, once dismissed as a remote island of poverty and lemurs, is suddenly central. It guards the Mozambique Channel, a choke point through which nearly 30% of Africa's maritime trade passes. To the east lies the Indo-Pacific, where the US, France, China, and India contest naval supremacy. To the west lies the Sahel, where AES has already rewritten the rules. For over a century, France maintained a naval presence in Diego Suarez, its old imperial jewel. But reports now suggest that operational access for French vessels has been quietly restricted. French crews no longer patrol freely, their movements require joint clearance with the Malagasy army. An admiral in Paris calls it unacceptable. But in Antananarivo, they call it sovereignty. Diplomats who once mocked the idea of an African axis begin to reconsider. From Bamako to Antsirabe, a web of discreet coordination starts to take shape. Not formal treaties. Not alliances on paper, but relationships of purpose. Shared intelligence. Training exchanges. Supply corridors disguised as humanitarian aid. An unnamed official from the African Union confides to a journalist. If Madagascar tilts toward the Sahel alignment, it changes the map forever. It means Africa's self-defense has reached the sea. That sentence, reach the sea, travels fast. Within days, online commentators call it the blue frontier of the AES doctrine. If sovereignty must be defended on land, then it must also be anchored on water. For the first time, Sahel meets the Indian Ocean. France moves to impose strategic reviews. The IMF delays a $300 million loan package pending stabilization. But none of these levers work as before. Madagascar's new leadership begins negotiating instead with regional banks, particularly those in West Africa aligned with AES principles. A quiet shift of capital follows. The same current that began in Bamako and Ouagadougou now laps the shores of Toamasina. Western analysts still call it contagion. But to those living it, it feels like convergence. Like Africa remembering something it was forced to forget. That independence was never meant to be conditional. At the same time, in the villages beyond Antsirabe, farmers and fishermen talk about politics in a way they never did before. They speak of dignity, energy sovereignty, and keeping our ports ours. Words once reserved for intellectuals now roll off the tongues of laborers and mothers. The revolution is not televised, it's whispered at dinner tables. And so, when a convoy of military trucks carrying the Madagascar flag drives through the rain that week, children stand by the roadside waving, not in fear, but pride. A woman watching from her doorway says quietly, "At least this time, they wear our colors." Outside the island, the tremor continues. Indian Ocean Security Councils convene emergency sessions. African think tanks discuss the Madagascar model, a form of controlled transition where the military steps in without seizing power outright. Ensuring continuity while reclaiming autonomy. It's not democracy by Western definition, but it is order by African design. They call it a coup, says a young Malagasy officer to a French journalist. He pauses, watching the rain hit his boots. We call it correction. He looks up, eyes calm, certain. And Africa calls it awakening. The reporter doesn't answer. She just turns off her camera, perhaps realizing that no interview could capture what's already begun. A continental movement too quiet for headlines, too steady to be stopped. They said Africa was divided, by languages, by oceans, by borders drawn in foreign ink. But when silence turns to song, even islands remember they belong to the same shore. The coup hasn't been announced, but it has already happened. Not with tanks, nor gunfire, nor the sound of boots storming the palace. It happened in whispers, in resignation letters. In silent withdrawals, in the flickering of the national TV feed that suddenly began to praise discipline and renewal. President Andry Rajoelina still sits behind the grand wooden desk of Iavaloa Palace. His flag still waves. His portrait still hangs in ministries. But the country knows, power has shifted hands. The military now guards not just the borders, but the airwaves. The ports, the silence. Across Antananarivo, armored vehicles don't block streets, they escort convoys of ministers leaving their offices by choice. One after another, they smile before cameras and declare their retirement for national unity. Behind those smiles are orders, not choices. General Zafasambo, until now a quiet name in the defense ministry, suddenly appears everywhere, calm, deliberate, always in control. He meets envoys from the African Union behind closed doors, describing this moment not as a coup, but as a temporary transition. His tone is not defensive. It is confident, as if the verdict of history has already sided with him. The international press calls it ambiguous. The people call it inevitable. In the markets, rumors spread faster than bread prices that Rajoelina has agreed to step aside. That a Council of Sovereignty will soon be declared, that foreign embassies have been warned to avoid unnecessary statements. And yet, no gunshots, no curfews, no chaos. Just a silence that feels like the breath before thunder. Is Madagascar quietly joining the Sahel line, not by geography, but by destiny? From Bamako to Ouagadougou, from Niamey to Antananarivo. Africa's pulse seems to beat to a single rhythm, reset. Not every coup is made by soldiers, some are born from exhaustion, from the moral collapse of systems that have forgotten who they serve. The general doesn't speak of revolution. He speaks of correction. He doesn't promise democracy. He promises dignity. And in a world where Africa's choices are often written elsewhere. That word, dignity, sounds dangerously powerful. In the evening, as the sun falls over the highlands, soldiers stand quietly beside civilians lighting candles outside the parliament. No slogans, no rage, just the weight of something historic, unspeakable, already in motion. A woman murmurs, "At least now, someone is listening." A soldier replies, "Let's hope they're listening too." That is how Madagascar changes, not in explosions, but in silence. Not in taking power, but in reclaiming purpose. Because Africa's coups are no longer military. They are social resets. And when the people begin to move as one, even silence becomes an act of defiance. Every revolution begins with darkness, until someone lights the street. Dawn breaks over Antananarivo. The air still carries the smoke of burned tires, but also the scent of wet soil and silence, the kind that comes when people have run out of fear. Soldiers stand at crossroads, not to block, but to watch. They no longer face the people, they stand beside them. A woman places a flower on the hood of a military truck. A boy salutes. An old man whispers a prayer. For the first time in years, no one asks who rules, only what future will be built. Perhaps it was never about seizing power, but reclaiming purpose. Madagascar, the island once forgotten in the vastness of the Indian Ocean, now stands on the edge of something larger, the awakening of a continent tired of being managed, ready to be free. And as the sun rises, its light hits the red soil like fire, spreading across faces, uniforms, and walls marked with a single word, Fadaranana, rebirth. If you believe this story matters for Africa's sovereignty, hit like, share your thoughts, and subscribe. Together, we keep the fire burning, not against the world, but for our freedom.